The last bakery on the block didn't stand a chance, or so Karen Hale believed. She walked in with a number that would make any sane person sell. The owner didn't even blink, so she grabbed the nearest tray of fresh croissants and hurled it across the room. Glass shattered. Flour exploded into the air like smoke from a grenade. She destroyed everything she could reach while the man behind the counter just stood there gripping the edge of the countertop saying nothing. A few days later, she found out that same man had once saved her life and never told a soul. Karen Hale did not believe in sentiment. Sentiment was what people hid behind when they lacked the nerve to make hard decisions. At 38, she had built Hale Development Group from a mid-tier real estate firm into one of the most aggressive urban development companies on the East Coast, and she had done it by treating every obstacle the same way as something to be removed. Her biggest project to date sat spread across her office wall in a massive architectural rendering Meridian Plaza, a mixed-use commercial complex that would replace an entire city block downtown. The design was sleek, modern, and ruthlessly efficient retail on the ground floors, premium office space above a rooftop terrace that would become the most photographed spot in the city. The investors had committed hundreds of millions of dollars. The timeline was locked. Every building on the block had been acquired, demolished, or was in the process of being cleared. Every building except one. Riverside Bakery sat on the corner of Maple and 9th like a stubborn tooth that refused to come loose. It was a small brick front shop with a hand-painted sign above the door and a window display of sourdough loaves and cinnamon rolls that looked like they belonged in a different century. In the shadow of construction cranes and half-demolished structures, the bakery looked almost absurd, a relic refusing to acknowledge that the world had moved on. Its owner was Adrian Carter. He was in his early 40s, broad-shouldered, with flour perpetually dusted across his forearms and a quiet steadiness in his eyes that made most people lower their voices around him. He had owned Riverside Bakery for nearly a decade, having opened it during a period of his life he rarely discussed. Those who knew him understood that the shop was more than a business. It was the thing that had pulled him back from the edge after losing his wife to a sudden illness, the thing that gave his days structure when everything else had collapsed. He had poured his grief into dough, his sleepless nights, into perfecting recipes, and somewhere along the way, the bakery had become the quiet center of the neighborhood. The elderly widow at the end of the street came every morning for the same rye bread. A construction worker from the next block grabbed black coffee before his shift without ever needing to order. A retired couple claimed the corner table by the window every Sunday like it was their living room. Adrian had built something that could not be measured in square footage or appraised by a real estate firm, and that was precisely why Karen Hale could not understand him. She arrived at Riverside Bakery on a Tuesday morning in October, stepping out of a black sedan with her assistant trailing 2 steps behind. She wore a charcoal suit that cost more than most of the equipment inside the shop. Her heels clicked against the old tile floor as she walked in, and the smell of fresh bread hit her like a wall, warm, yeasty, almost aggressive in its simplicity. Adrian was behind the counter sliding a tray of rolls into the display case. He looked up, recognized her immediately, and said nothing. Karen dismissed her assistant with a glance. The door closed. She placed a folder on the counter between them. $3.2 million, she said. That is 4 times the assessed value of this property and everything in it. You could relocate anywhere in the country. You could retire. Adrian wiped his hands on his apron and looked at the folder without opening it. I appreciate the offer, Ms. Hale, but I am not selling. You haven't even looked at the number. I don't need to. He met her eyes with a calm that bordered on immovable. This place is not about the number. It is about what it means to the people who come here every day. It is about what it means to me. You cannot put a price on that. Karen had heard versions of this speech from other holdouts over the years. She had always found a way past it. She opened the folder herself and slid it closer to him. $4 million. Final offer. That is more than generous, and you know it. Adrian looked at the paper, then back at her. He shook his head slowly. Something behind Karen's eyes shifted. It was not a single moment of anger, it was the accumulation of months. Months of delays of conference calls with impatient investors, of Richard Wynn's voice on the phone, reminding her that time was money and her credibility was on the line. Months of watching her timeline slip because of one man and his bread. Her hand shot out and swept the nearest tray off the counter, croissants and rolls scattered across the floor. Adrian flinched but did not move. "Do you have any idea what you are costing me?" Karen's voice cracked with a fury she had not intended to release. She grabbed a glass vase of wildflowers from the counter and hurled it against the wall. It exploded into shards and water. She shoved a display shelf and it toppled with a crash, jars of jam, bags of flour, and stacked boxes of pastries, all cascading to the floor in a cloud of white dust. She was breathing hard, her hands trembling, flour settling on her suit like ash. Adrian stood behind the counter. His jaw was tight. His fingers were locked around the edge of the countertop so hard the wood groaned under the pressure. He was not calm. Anyone who looked closely could see the anger burning behind his eyes, the way his chest rose and fell with controlled, deliberate breaths. But he did not raise his voice. He did not move toward her. Karen stared at him for a long, terrible second. Then she turned and walked out, slamming the door hard enough to rattle what was left of the glass. Adrian stood alone in the wreckage. Flour hung in the air. Broken glass glittered on the tile. The wildflowers lay scattered in a puddle of water among crushed pastries and overturned trays. He looked down at his hands. They were shaking. He knelt and began picking up the pieces one by one in silence. The days that followed were not kind to Karen. She threw herself into work with a ferocity that alarmed even her most loyal staff, barking orders in meetings, rejecting proposals. She would normally have approved staying in her office until midnight, with the lights of the city below her and the Meridian Plaza blueprints spread across every surface. She told herself the bakery incident was nothing, a moment of frustration, collateral damage in a war that had stakes far larger than one man's feelings. But the image kept returning, Adrian standing behind the counter, silent, his fingers locked around the edge of the countertop, the anger in his eyes that he refused to let out. It was on a Thursday evening, nearly a week later, that the crack appeared. Karen was at home, sorting through a box of old documents she had been meaning to organize for years. Medical records, insurance claims, legal correspondence, remnants of the car accident that had nearly killed her 6 years ago. A truck had run a red light on Route 17 during a rainstorm. Her car had flipped twice and come to rest upside down in a ditch. She remembered almost nothing from that night, only fragments. Rain on her face, the smell of gasoline, a voice telling her to stay awake. She had always known that someone had pulled her from the wreck and driven her to the emergency room before the ambulance arrived. The doctors had told her that without those lost minutes, she likely would not have survived. But the man had left before anyone recorded his name. It had always been a blank space in her story, a faceless stranger she owed her life to and could never thank. Now, flipping through the yellowed pages, she found a note clipped to the back of her admission file. It was handwritten by the attending physician on duty that night, a brief description of the man who had carried her in male early to mid-30s, strong build, visibly shaken with white powder, likely flour on his jacket and in his hair. He had stayed in the waiting room for over 5 hours, refusing to leave until the doctors confirmed she was stable. Then he had walked out without giving his name. Karen read the note 3 times. Flour on his jacket. The image hit her like a physical blow, Adrian Carter standing in his destroyed bakery, flour in the air, flour on every surface, flour on his hands as he knelt to pick up the broken glass. She sat very still for a long time. The next morning, she drove to the hospital. It took 2 hours and 3 different departments before she found someone who remembered that night, Dr. Samuel Briggs, now semi-retired and working part-time in the clinic. He was a gray-haired man with reading glasses perched on his forehead and a memory sharper than his filing system. "I remember him," Dr. Briggs said, leaning back in his chair. You do not forget the ones who carry someone in covered in blood and refuse to leave. He sat in that waiting room all night, would not eat, would not drink coffee, just sat there staring at the door. When I told him you were going to make it, he stood up, nodded once, and left. Did he say anything about himself? Karen asked. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, fingers pressing into each other until they ached. Not much. I asked him how he knew you. He said he didn't. He just happened to be driving past and saw the wreck. I remember thinking he smelled like a bakery. Had flour all over him like he had come straight from work. Dr. Briggs tilted his head. Why did you ever find him? Karen did not answer the question. She thanked the doctor and walked out of the hospital into the cold morning air. She sat in her car for 20 minutes without starting the engine. The man who had saved her life, who had carried her broken body out of a wrecked car and sat in a hospital waiting room for 5 hours just to make sure she survived, was the same man whose bakery she had torn apart with her bare hands. And he had never said a word about it. Karen did not go back to the bakery the next day, or the day after that. She went to work. She chaired meetings. She reviewed construction timelines and approved vendor contracts and answered emails with the same crisp efficiency that had defined her entire career. From the outside, nothing had changed. Karen Hale was still the woman who walked into rooms and made them quieter, who could read a balance sheet the way other people read novels, who never second-guessed a decision once it was made. But something had shifted beneath the surface, and she could feel it the way you feel a crack in a foundation before the walls start to show it. She told herself it did not matter. The fact that Adrian Carter had once pulled her from a wrecked car on a rainy night 6 years ago did not change the math. Meridian Plaza was not a personal project. It was a machine with hundreds of moving parts, thousands of jobs and investors who measured progress in quarterly returns. One man's good deed, however extraordinary, could not outweigh the obligations she carried. She repeated this to herself in the shower, in the car, in the elevator up to her office. She said it with such conviction that she almost believed it. But then she would sit down at her desk and the blueprints of Meridian Plaza would be right there in front of her, and her eyes would drift to the corner of Maple and 9th, that small rectangle on the map labeled Parcel 17 Pending Acquisition, and the image would flood back. Not the architectural rendering, not the projected retail revenue, just Adrian standing behind his counter in a cloud of flour dust, gripping the countertop edge, his chest rising and falling with the kind of anger a decent man holds inside because he refuses to let it win. She started sleeping badly. She would lie awake until 2 or 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, her mind running the same loop over and over. She snapped at her assistant for scheduling a lunch meeting on the wrong day. She rejected a contractor's proposal that her team had already approved, then reversed her own decision an hour later without explanation. Her chief of staff asked if everything was all right, and Karen told him to focus on his own work. The truth about Adrian was doing something she had not expected. It was not guilt exactly. Karen had trained herself to operate beyond guilt years ago. It was something worse. It was the slow, corrosive realization that she might be wrong. Not wrong about the project, not wrong about the numbers, but wrong about the kind of person she had become. She had stood in a man's shop, a man who had carried her bleeding body out of a ditch and sat in a hospital waiting room until dawn just to make sure she lived, and she had destroyed his things and screamed at him like he was nothing. And that man had looked at her and said nothing. 2 weeks after the visit to Dr. Briggs, Karen drove to Maple and 9th. She parked a block away and sat in her car for 10 minutes before getting out. The bakery was open. Through the window, she could see Adrian behind the counter arranging loaves on a wooden rack. The broken display shelf had been replaced with a simpler one. The tile floor was clean. If there were scars from her outburst, Adrian had already repaired them. A bell chimed above the door as she walked in. Adrian looked up. His expression did not change, but his hands went still. Karen stood near the entrance, her arms at her sides. She was not carrying a folder. She was not wearing the charcoal suit. She looked for the first time in their brief and violent history like someone who had come without a strategy. "I came to apologize," she said. "What I did was inexcusable. I want to pay for every piece of damage, the equipment, the products, the shelf, everything. I will have a crew here by the end of the week to replace anything that needs replacing." Adrian set the loaf he was holding onto the rack and wiped his hands on his apron. He looked at her for a long time, not with the calm steadiness she had seen before, but with something rawer, something closer to the surface. "You think this is about equipment?" His voice was low, but carried an edge she had not heard from him before. "You think you can write a check, and that fixes what you did?" Karen opened her mouth, but Adrian was not finished. "You did not just break a few trays, Ms. Hale. You walked into the one place in this city where people still feel like they belong somewhere, and you tore it apart because you did not get what you wanted." He took a step closer, and his eyes were hard. "Do you know what Mrs. Patterson said when she came in the next morning and saw the mess? She is 81 years old. She has been coming here every single day since I opened this place. She stood in the doorway and asked me if I was okay. She was worried about me. That is what this place is. That is what you tried to destroy." His voice cracked just barely on the last word. He caught himself and straightened. "I rebuilt every shelf. I cleaned every inch of that floor. I threw away 2 days' worth of product that I could not sell because it was covered in glass. And I did it alone at 4 in the morning because I did not want anyone else to see what it looked like." Karen stood very still. She had walked into this shop expecting resistance, maybe coldness, maybe even refusal. She had not expected this, the raw, unfiltered weight of a man telling her exactly how much damage she had caused. Adrian exhaled slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something quieter, something that was not anger, but something heavier than anger. "I know why you are really here," he said. "You found out about the accident." The words landed like a stone in the room. Karen felt the blood drain from her face. "Dr. Briggs is a regular here," Adrian said. "He comes in every Saturday morning for sourdough and coffee. He mentioned that a woman had been asking about the man who brought in a car accident patient 6 years ago. He described you. It was not hard to put together." Karen opened her mouth, but nothing came. "I did not pull you out of that car so that someday you would owe me something." He held her gaze without flinching. "I did it because you were trapped and bleeding and no one else was there. That is it. That is the entire reason. And I do not want gratitude to be the only thing that makes you treat another person with basic decency." Karen felt the sentence hit something deep inside her chest, a place she had spent years covering with conference calls and quarterly reports and the relentless forward motion of ambition. She wanted to say something, but every response she could think of sounded hollow. She left the bakery without another word. The bell chimed behind her. She sat in her car and pressed her forehead against the steering wheel, her breath unsteady. She had come hoping to settle a debt. Instead, she had been told the debt was never the point. Over the following weeks, something changed in Karen's routine. She began driving past Maple and 9th on her way to the office, even though it added 15 minutes to her commute. She never stopped. She just slowed down as she passed and looked through the bakery window. She saw things she had never noticed before. Every morning just after 6, the lights inside Riverside Bakery flickered on. A few minutes later, the first ribbons of warm air would drift from the vents above the door, carrying the smell of bread and butter and cinnamon into the still dark street. Adrian would appear behind the counter, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had performed the same ritual 1,000 times, sliding trays into the oven, checking temperatures, dusting flour from the wooden prep table with the back of his hand. By 6:30, the first customer would arrive. It was almost always the same person, an elderly woman with white hair pinned under a blue scarf, moving slowly with a cane. Mrs. Patterson. Adrian would have her rye bread sliced and bagged before she reached the counter. She never had to ask. They would exchange a few words about the weather, about her garden, about nothing in particular, and she would leave with a warmth in her face that had nothing to do with the bread. Then came the morning regulars one by one, each slipping into the rhythm of the shop, like instruments joining an orchestra. The construction worker, a tall man named Derek who always wore a reflective vest, grabbed his black coffee and left $1 tip in the jar without breaking stride. A young woman with paint-stained jeans picked up 2 almond croissants every Wednesday and Thursday. The retired couple, the Morrisons, took the corner table by the window every Sunday morning and stayed for 2 hours reading the newspaper and sharing a plate of scones. No one was in a hurry. No one was performing. It was just people showing up in the same place at the same time, held together by nothing more than habit and the quiet understanding that they were welcome. Karen had built towers. She had reshaped city blocks. She had sat across from billionaires and negotiated deals that made the evening news. But watching Adrian Carter hand a cup of coffee to a man in a hard hat at 6:45 in the morning, she understood with a clarity that unsettled her she had never built anything like this. She had never built something that made people feel known. The realization did not arrive as an epiphany. It arrived as a slow ache, the kind that sets in when you realize you have been walking in the wrong direction for a very long time, and the path back is longer than the path forward. On a Monday morning in late November, Karen's assistant placed a memo on her desk marked Urgent Confidential. It was from Richard Wynn. Wynn was the principal investor behind Meridian Plaza, a man who had made his fortune in commercial real estate and who treated every project like a military campaign. He was 63, silver-haired, and had a reputation for being patient exactly once. Karen had already used up that patience months ago. The memo was brief and surgical. Wynn was calling an emergency board meeting for the following Friday. The agenda had one item, the unresolved status of Parcel 17. The language was polite. The meaning was not. The meeting itself was worse than the memo. Wynn sat at the head of the conference table in a navy suit, his reading glasses folded in his breast pocket, and laid out the situation in the flat, measured tone of a man who had already made his decision and was now explaining it to everyone else. The timeline for Meridian Plaza was set 14 months ago, he said, his eyes moving around the table before settling on Karen. We are now 3 months behind schedule, and the single largest obstacle is a bakery. A bakery. He let the word hang in the air. I have been patient, Karen. The board has been patient. But patience is not a renewable resource. He placed a single sheet of paper on the table. Blackwell Group has approached me twice in the last 6 weeks. They are prepared to take over the development contract at current valuation if we cannot demonstrate that this project is moving forward. I do not want to make that call, but I will if I have to. Karen felt the room tighten around her. Blackwell Group was her direct competitor, a firm that had been circling Meridian Plaza since the first delay was announced. You have 30 days, Wynn said. Resolve the bakery situation, or I pull my funding and take the Blackwell offer. That is not a negotiation. After the meeting, Karen's head of legal, a sharp-eyed woman named Grace Holloway, followed her back to her office and closed the door. There is another option, Grace said. She placed a folder on Karen's desk. Our team found a municipal zoning provision, Section 12, subsection C, that allows the city to initiate eminent domain proceedings when a property is deemed to obstruct a project of significant public benefit. Meridian Plaza qualifies. The documentation is already prepared. All it needs is your authorization to file. Karen opened the folder. The paperwork was immaculate. Every form filled out, every legal precedent, cited every signature line marked with a small adhesive tab. It was in the language of the law, a perfectly clean way to force Adrian Carter out of his bakery without ever raising her voice again. If you file this week, Grace continued, the city council can fast-track the review. We could have a ruling within 20 days, well within Wynn's deadline. Karen stared at the folder. And Adrian, he would receive fair market compensation as determined by the city assessor, likely around $800,000. He would have 60 days to vacate. $800,000, less than a quarter of what Karen had offered him in person. The law would take his bakery and pay him a fraction of its worth, and there was nothing he could do about it. Grace stood by the door, waiting. "Leave it with me," Karen said. That night, Karen sat alone in her office. The city lights stretched out below her like a circuit board, cold and precise. The eminent domain folder lay open on her desk, a pen resting across the signature line. To her left, the Meridian Plaza rendering hung on the wall, every glass panel, every walkway, every perfectly calculated sightline. It was the largest thing she had ever attempted to build, the project that would define her legacy, the proof that Karen Hale could bend an entire city block to her will. She picked up the pen. She thought about Richard Wynn's 30-day ultimatum. She thought about Blackwell Group, waiting in the wings. She thought about the hundreds of jobs tied to Meridian Plaza, the contracts already signed, the reputation she had spent 15 years constructing. Then she thought about Adrian Carter, kneeling on a flower-covered floor at 4 in the morning, picking up broken glass alone. She thought about Mrs. Patterson standing in the doorway, asking if he was okay. She thought about a man sitting in a hospital waiting room for 5 hours covered in flour and someone else's blood, refusing to leave until a stranger was out of danger. And she heard his voice, low and steady, cutting through everything. "I do not want gratitude to be the only thing that makes you treat another person with basic decency." Karen looked at the pen in her hand. She looked at the signature line. She looked at the rendering on the wall. She set the pen down on the desk and closed the folder. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 9 in the morning. Karen arrived at 7. She had spent the past 72 hours doing something she had never done in her career, dismantling her own plan. She had called her lead architect at home on a Saturday night and told him to redesign Meridian Plaza from scratch, preserving the bakery at the corner of Maple and 9th and building the entire complex around it. The architect had asked her if she was serious. She told him she had never been more serious about anything. By Monday evening, the new renderings were ready, rough, unpolished, but structurally sound. The bakery would sit at the center of the main courtyard, surrounded by open pedestrian space, with the modern glass towers rising behind it like a frame around an old photograph. The cost increase was significant. The redesign would add months to the timeline and millions to the budget. Karen knew every number by heart before she walked into that boardroom. Richard Wynn was already seated when the rest of the board filed in. He looked at Karen the way a surgeon looks at a patient who has refused the recommended procedure, with professional detachment and a trace of something close to pity. Karen did not sit down. She stood at the head of the table and pulled up the new renderings on the screen behind her. "Before anyone speaks," she said, "I want to show you what I am proposing." The room went quiet. She walked them through the redesigned layout, the repositioned retail wings, the expanded courtyard, the integration of the bakery into the central pedestrian plaza. She explained the revised cost projections, the adjusted timeline, the new marketing angle. She did not sugarcoat any of it. "This will cost more," she said. "It will take longer. I am not going to stand here and pretend otherwise. But what we will build is something that no other development firm in this city has ever attempted, a commercial space that is not just functional, but meaningful." Riverside Bakery has been part of this neighborhood for nearly a decade. It is where people go when they need to feel like they belong somewhere. Tearing it down does not just remove a building. It removes the reason people care about this block in the first place. She looked directly at Wynn. "If we build Meridian Plaza the way it was originally designed, it will be a good project, profitable, efficient, and it will look exactly like every other mixed-use development in every other city in this country. No one will remember it in 5 years." She let that settle. "But if we build it around something real, something that already has a heartbeat, we create a story. And stories are what make people show up." The silence that followed was the longest of Karen's career. Wynn leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. 2 board members exchanged glances. Grace Holloway studied her notes without looking up. Then Wynn spoke. "You are asking me to invest additional capital and accept a delayed return because of a bakery." "I am asking you to invest in a project that people will actually care about," Karen said. "The bakery is not the obstacle, it is the asset." Wynne stared at her for a long time. Then he turned to the board. "I want the revised financial projections on my desk by Friday. Full risk analysis, construction timeline, and a marketing brief." He looked back at Karen. "You get your chance. 1. If the numbers do not hold, we go back to the original plan, and I make the call to Blackwell myself." Karen nodded once. It was not a victory. It was a reprieve. But it was enough. The months that followed were the hardest of Karen's professional life. The redesign required renegotiating contracts with nearly every vendor. 2 subcontractors dropped out. 1 board member resigned in protest, calling the decision reckless. The construction press ran a piece titled, "Hale Development Bets Millions on a Bakery," and the tone was not kind. Karen worked through all of it. She was in the office before dawn and often did not leave until after midnight. She reviewed every blueprint revision personally. She sat in on engineering meetings she would normally have delegated. She made the kind of small, unglamorous decisions that no one would ever write about, but that kept the project from collapsing under its own ambition. She did not visit Riverside Bakery during the construction. She did not call Adrian. She did not ask for his approval or his gratitude. She simply built. Meridian Plaza opened on a clear Saturday morning in September, nearly a year after Karen had closed the eminent domain folder on her desk. The complex was striking clean lines of glass and steel, arranged around a wide central courtyard filled with young maple trees and stone benches. Retail shops lined the ground floor. Office tenants had already signed leases for every floor above. A rooftop terrace overlooked the river to the east and the city skyline to the west. And at the heart of it all, exactly where it had always been, stood Riverside Bakery. The old brick facade had not been touched. The hand-painted sign still hung above the door, its letters slightly faded by sun and rain. The window display still held rows of sourdough loaves and cinnamon rolls arranged on wooden boards. Against the polished glass and steel of the surrounding towers, the bakery looked like something from another era, small, warm, stubbornly human. It was the first thing people noticed when they walked into the courtyard. It was the thing every newspaper photographed. It was the thing that made Meridian Plaza different from every other development in the city. Not the architecture, not the rooftop terrace, not the square footage, but the small bakery at its center that had refused to move. The crowds that filled the courtyard on opening day drifted naturally toward the bakery, drawn by the smell of fresh bread cutting through the autumn air. The line stretched out the door and across the plaza. Mrs. Patterson was there sitting on one of the new stone benches with her rye bread in her lap, watching the crowd with a quiet satisfaction. Derek walked past in his reflective vest, coffee in hand, nodding at Adrian through the window. The Morrisons had already claimed their corner table. The story of the bakery that would not sell spread quickly, first through local news, then through social media, then through the kind of word of mouth that no marketing budget could buy. People came to Meridian Plaza not just to shop or work, but to see the place for themselves. They took photographs in front of the bakery. They bought loaves of bread they did not need. They sat in the courtyard and stayed longer than they had planned because something about the space made them want to linger. Karen came on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after the opening. She wore a simple coat and carried nothing. She walked into Riverside Bakery, and the bell above the door chimed the same way it always had. Adrian was behind the counter, sliding a tray of rolls into the display case. He looked up and saw her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Just coffee," Karen said, "and whatever you recommend this morning." Adrian poured her a cup and set a warm almond croissant on a plate. She paid, took the corner table by the door, and sat down. It became a routine. Every Tuesday and Friday morning, Karen arrived at Riverside Bakery before 7. She ordered coffee and whatever Adrian recommended. She sat alone watching the courtyard fill with early commuters and dog walkers and the slow parade of morning regulars. She did not bring her phone to the table. She did not check emails. She just sat. One Friday morning in late October, the bakery was quiet. The breakfast rush had not yet arrived. Karen was at her usual table when Adrian came around the counter and set a fresh cup of coffee in front of her. He sat down across from her, something he had never done before. "I never told you about the accident," he said, "because I never thought it was something that needed to be repaid. You were hurt. I was there. That is all it ever was." Karen looked at him. She wanted to say something about how wrong she had been, about how much the past year had changed her, about how she had spent her entire adult life building things without ever understanding what made them worth building. But the words felt too large for the small table between them. "Thank you," she said. It was the only thing that felt honest enough. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then, for the first time since she had known him, he smiled, not the cautious, guarded expression of a man protecting himself, but something open, something that carried the weight of forgiveness without needing to name it. Outside, the morning light filled the courtyard of Meridian Plaza. The glass towers caught the sun and scattered it in bright fragments across the stone. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the open door of Riverside Bakery, mixing with the cool October air, reaching the benches and the walkways and the far edges of the plaza, where strangers slowed their steps, drawn by something they could not quite name but did not want to leave behind. At the center of everything Karen Hale had built, the smallest thing turned out to be the only thing that mattered. Sometimes the people who change our lives the most are not the ones who announce it. They are the ones who show up quietly, do what needs to be done, and never ask for anything in return. And sometimes it takes breaking something beautiful to realize it was the most valuable thing in the room all along. If this story reminded you of someone who has been that person for you, someone who showed up when it mattered and never made it about themselves, maybe take a moment today to let them know. And if you are still here listening to this, I just want to say thank you. Every time you show up here, you are part of something too. If this story moved you, leave a comment and tell me what would you have done in Karen's place. Would you have signed that paper? I will be reading every single one. And if you have not already, hit that subscribe button so you do not miss what comes next. I will see you in the next one.